Fairfax County, Virginia is rich in history. When we think of the county and the people who lived here, we often think of George Washington, George Mason, Clara Barton, and the family of Robert E. Lee, whose land holdings and contributions to the county and the nation have been recognized and documented. In contrast, the role of African Americans in Fairfax County mainly has been overlooked, unchronicled, and forgotten. Have you ever heard of Frederick Foote, John Bell, or Mary Stuart? Well, these individuals were also notable figures in Fairfax County history. Part of the reason for their omission from history books is that the record of African American contributions is mostly oral. The majority of black people were denied educational opportunities equaling those of whites until the 1960s. As a result, the African American experience of living and growing together, sharing life's sorrows and celebrations as a community, has been passed down verbally from generation to generation. To recognize this oral tradition and preserve African American history in Fairfax County, BUFA, the Black Women United for Action, created a quilt. As an organization dedicated to educating the total community about contributions and needs of the county's black population, BUFA saw the quilt as a tangible reminder of African American involvement in the growth and development of Fairfax County. Lillian Blackwell, a Vienna resident who filed a complaint against Fairfax County in 1959 so her children could go to integrated schools, did most of the stitching on the quilt. Each square was researched and designed in the hope that it might serve as a catalyst for all people to explore the past in order to understand the present. The quilt depicts scenes of educational, religious, family, and social life in African American communities. These communities include parts of Chantilly and Herndon, Vienna, Falls Church, Audrick's Corner, Bailey's Crossroads, and the area surrounding Gum Springs. In each community, people had a story to tell, a story of contribution and achievement. In the 1800s, Chantilly was known for its excellent farmland. In 1892, at the age of 21, George Coates purchased a parcel of land in the Chantilly area for farming. For many years, he and his wife Betty, along with their 12 children, worked the land, raising livestock and dairy cows. George also did road work for the county to help make ends meet. After World War II, George's son Leslie helped the family become a competitive member of the Milk Producer Association. He shipped milk throughout the Mid-Atlantic region using Chestnut Farmers Milk Distributors in Washington, D.C. The Coates Farm was recognized as one of the few successful African American-owned businesses in Fairfax County during the 1940s and 50s. Following the death of his parents, Leslie Coates purchased the family farm from his brothers and sisters in 1957. The next year, when the property was designated for Dulles Airport, 55 of his 129 acres had to be sold to the government. The construction of the airport not only affected Leslie Coates, but the entire community of Willard, which was home to 50 other African American families. Mr. Coates recalls how he was treated at the time of the sale and what difficulty there would have been had he been forced to relocate.
When the airport came in and they said they had to have it, so they had everybody that was land that was in the airport area was condemned, and they put a price on it, and you could take it or leave it. So they weren't too rough on me because I was black, and it would be harder for me to relocate than anybody else, because at that time it was hard for a black person to buy land. But if you didn't have it, well, you just couldn't buy it.
Progress has taken its toll on areas of the county in which African Americans settled. You may not be familiar with Hortontown in Centerville, Cooktown in Herndon, or Williamstown in Merrifield. These were established black communities which dissolved as residential and industrial growth and mass development took over the county. Much of the farmland, which offered economic opportunity and equality for black people, has been developed into subdivisions, schools, and shopping centers, forcing many of the families out of their communities. In some instances, historical landmarks such as the Robinson family mill and slave block in Centerville have been destroyed in the name of progress. Today, the Mount Pleasant Baptist Church on Coppermine Road is in danger of being torn down to allow for growth and development in the Herndon area. Built in 1866, the year after the Civil War ended, the Mount Pleasant Baptist Church rests on its original foundation, but its fate is uncertain. Debate is ongoing between developers and concerned members of the community over whether or not to leave this church standing. One historical building in the Herndon area, which still stands as a private residence, is the Flores Colored School. Originally built in 1870 with slate floors and a pot-bellied coal stove, the school was rebuilt in 1932 with contributions from the Rosenwald Fund. Rosenwald was a philanthropist and the president of Sears and Roebuck Company, who subsidized the building of over 5,000 black schools in the South between 1914 and 1932. Mary Stewart, a black woman who taught at the one-room Flores Colored School for 42 years, instilled in her students a commitment to excellence. Her selfless acts of dedication included picking up children on the way from her home in Chantilly to the school in Herndon. Until 1932, she used a horse-drawn wagon. Then she drove a Model T Ford until the county provided school buses in 1937. Having no children of her own, Mary often let young people stay at her home so they could further their education. Another teacher and longtime principal of Flores Colored School was Ludy Coates, Leslie's wife. Ludy continued in Mary Stewart's footsteps, devoting herself to the education of black children and providing financial assistance for several students aspiring to higher education. It was individuals like these women, trailblazers who were willing to go the extra mile for the sake of education, who became forerunners of the NAACP and the United Negro College Fund. At the time of the Civil War, white families in Northern Virginia and throughout the country were divided over the slavery issue. Andrew Head and his son Brian owned Head's Hill Farm in Vienna, which at one point was used as a hospital for Union soldiers. Clara Ferris Williams inherited Head's Hill Farm. Clara was of mixed racial parentage. Her father, Brian Head, was white, and her mother was a black slave. Until she sold it in 1973, Clara, with her husband Alfonso, raised dairy cattle and operated an inn at Head's Hill Farm. At the end of the Civil War, several areas of Fairfax County provided diverse opportunities for African Americans, one of which was Vienna. Freedmen had their first chance to buy land, build homes, and have salaried jobs. During this time, there were many demonstrations of concern and loyalty between black and white families. Fairfax landowner Harmon Salisbury was the Union captain of a black regiment. After the war, he set aside a large portion of his Vienna property for purchase by his former soldiers. Since they weren't paid anything as slaves and they weren't paid much as soldiers, cash was particularly hard to come by for African Americans. So Captain Salisbury extended easy credit. He sold lots for $100 an acre, which equals about $60,000 on today's market. The money could be paid over a 10-year period, with the first 5 years being interest-free. Salisbury's foresight provided the opportunity for many black families to own land. Around the same time, in 1867, Major Orrin Hine, who later became the mayor of Vienna, donated property on which the African American community could build a church. At the time of construction, the building committee received permission from the government to use lumber from abandoned ammunition shelters in Northern Virginia. Named the First Black Baptist Church in Vienna, it was the first church built in Vienna by either a black or white congregation. Although the church was the center of social life for the African American community, Robert Payne, a lifelong resident of Vienna, remembers other social activities in the early 1900s.
When I was growing up for social activity, we had lawn parties, house parties. We used to have teen dances at the schoolhouse. And of course we had a baseball park at the Elks home on Nutley Street. And we had baseball games there on Saturdays and Sundays. It was an enclosed baseball park. So we had plenty of recreational activities for that time.
For decades, African Americans lacked educational opportunity. Although a few plantation slaves were given lessons by the white children's tutor, for the most part, it was considered illegal to teach a slave how to read and write. Then, from 1870 to 1965, Fairfax County Public Schools provided for the elementary education of black children, but segregated them in separate schools apart from the white children. In the early years, the school system agreed to pay for teachers at the black schools, only if local communities provided the facilities. Vienna's black community strongly supported education for their young people through the local school league, an organization of African American parents, predecessor of today's PTA. In the late 1890s, the Vienna community built a school at Lawyers and Malcolm Roads. A pot-bellied stove provided heat, but there was no electricity, running water, or indoor plumbing for 40 years until Louise Archer, a Vienna School League member, involved herself with facility improvement in the 1930s. Louise Archer led several fundraisers to enable the Vienna School League to purchase land in 1938 from B.F. Salisbury, a direct descendant of Captain Salisbury. Completed in 1948, the school they built was one of the first modern schools for black students and had classrooms, restrooms, central heating, a kitchen, and an auditorium which converted into a cafeteria. The school was appropriately named after Louise Archer. Today, Seven Corners in Falls Church is a congested area with shopping centers, restaurants, and professional offices. However, this land had been a quiet country crossroads owned by Frederick Foote, an African American. Born into slavery near Burke, Virginia, Frederick Foote joined the Union Army soon after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. He served his military duty as a blacksmith in Fairfax County, and during his off hours, mostly nights, he worked on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. In 1864, Foote purchased 28 acres of land from his former owner at a reported cost of $565. In 1881, as the first black man to be elected to the Falls Church Town Council, Foote began to recognize the economic value of the land and, in his will, forbade his descendants to sell it. Pressured by high taxes and the interest of local developers, Foote's descendants received legal permission to sell part of the property in 1952. The $1 million sale became one of the largest real estate transactions by an African American family in Fairfax County history. Another African American landowner who contributed greatly to the Falls Church area was civic activist James Lee. Lee lived in an area of the county known as the Hill, which spanned Annandale Road from Hillwood Avenue to Jefferson Village. Lee took pride in his home and felt a great sense of responsibility to his community. These values were instilled in his 12 children, and when James Lee's youngest son, Russell, inherited his father's home, along with acres of apple orchards, he donated land for the construction of a public school because the county was unable to provide either land or resources for a school for black children. Initially named the Falls Church Colored School in 1922 and later renamed the James Lee Elementary School in 1948, the school's history can be traced to 1864, when Betsy Reed and her father, J.D., established a school in Falls Church for former slaves. Northern Virginia had become a haven for blacks seeking freedom, work, and education because there were established communities of black people in Fairfax County dating from the 1700s. Betsy and J.D., who were whites from the North, provided educational opportunities that were previously unavailable for African Americans in the Falls Church area. For associating with black people and trying to correct injustices toward them, J.D. Reed was murdered by Mosby's men late in 1864, and his daughter Betsy left Falls Church shortly thereafter. The school Betsy and J.D. founded resumed at the same location. Attendance grew, and a nearby building, the Oddfellows School, was used for the upper grades. Mr. Arthur Reed, no relation to Betsy and J.D., was a student at the Oddfellows School and remembers the daily walk.
I walk about 5 miles, 5 miles every day morning, even to go through the Falls Church and school. Falls Church, 5 miles from Bailey's Crossroads to Falls Church.
Today, the beginning of the Dulles Toll Road is a familiar Tyson's Corner landmark. In 1872, however, the 30 acres of land on which the first toll gate now stands was purchased by African-American Alfred Audrick for $450.74. The area became known as Audrick's Corner. A carpenter by trade, Audrick cleared the land for farming and built a house. Audrick realized that his children and those of his neighbors would have little opportunity for schooling unless someone in the black community initiated the building of a schoolhouse. So he constructed a school on his own property. The Audrick School building was part meeting house, part schoolhouse, and at times served as a center of religious life. Since the school was in such demand for community activities, Audrick donated more land and eventually, along with Minister Cyrus Carter, built the Shiloh Baptist Church. 70 years after the school opened, Mrs. May Hall's children attended Audrick School in the 1930s.
It was a one-room school, about 75 or 80 children, 7 grades, and they had outdoor privies. And we had a league, and Mr. Henry Coates was the president of that league, and he had a little bus that he let the we sold it to the league, and Margaret Coates, his daughter, was the first black driver in Fairfax County, and ours was the first bus to carry black children in Fairfax County.
Cecil Robinson was the last principal of Audrick School before it closed. He remembers the involvement of the parents in the community.
And I must say something about the dear parents that helped to serve this school. They were very devoted to the school in that there was nothing that we asked of them that they weren't willing to help with.
Diane Smith Long is the great-great-granddaughter of Alfred Audrick. She has tried to live up to his legacy by participating in service organizations such as Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority. She feels her commitment to service is due in large part to her awareness of family heritage.
Even though my great-great-grandfather was not a learned man, he understood the importance of education. And he instilled in his children a sense of pride and civic and community responsibility, an obligation and duty to family, the importance of land, and also the importance of self-sufficiency.
Not far from Audrick's Corner was Oakland, a densely populated area just south of Bailey's Crossroads, in which almost half of the population was black. In 1876, John Bell, a successful African-American missionary, active member of the Freedmen's Bureau, and respected employee of the U.S. Patent Office, bought 50 acres near Oakland for $2,500. By doing so, John Bell became the first African-American commuter. He continued to work in Washington, D.C. while living in Fairfax County. In spite of his personal success, Bell was sensitive to the injustices toward other black men who were not as fortunate as he was. He recognized the need for communication between the black and white communities. Bell dedicated much of his life to the civil rights of all people, working with the Fairfax County government to promote racial tolerance in Bailey's Crossroads. As it was for most African Americans, the church was instrumental in Bell's life. When he wasn't needed in the patent office, he traveled on horseback as a missionary throughout Virginia and North Carolina. Although white congregations usually restricted black worshipers to a back row pew or balcony, Bell encouraged his friends not to accept these traditional designated areas as a way of life. Bell thought that all people should be free to participate in worship, not just observe, and as a result, organized the construction of separate churches for African Americans. Having been tutored by his former master when he was enslaved, Bell understood the value of education. Like Alfred Audrick, Russell Lee, and many others, Bell donated his own land for a school for black children. Built in 1880, the school became the first and only school to serve African Americans in the Bailey's Crossroads area for 40 years, until Warner Baptist Church was used as a school in 1920. Mr. John H. White recalls the lack of schooling for black students who wanted to go beyond the 7th grade in the first half of the 1900s.
Bell donated the land for the colored school, in which was a 3-room, and it was one of the only 3-room schools in Fairfax County for colored. During my time when I attended the school, we attended all the way up to the 6th or 7th grade. And after attending school there, graduating, there were no schools in Fairfax County for high school colored students. So they either went to Washington, D.C. to school or to Manassas. And I attended Manassas Industrial School up to the 12th grade.
George Washington, gentleman farmer, general in the Revolutionary War, and first president of the United States, lived in a time when slavery was an accepted part of life for many Southern landowners. But after the Revolutionary War, he resolved never to buy or sell slaves again. In fact, his will provided for the release of his slaves and left instructions for their care. Born into slavery, West Ford became the manager of Mount Vernon for George Washington's family after the president died in 1799. 32 years later, at age 47, Ford was officially freed by Hannah Washington, George's sister-in-law. In recognition of his dedicated service, Ford received land in the southeastern part of Fairfax County, deeded to him by George Washington. This land, located in the area of Route 1, Sherwood Hall Lane and Parker's Lane, became the location of an African-American settlement known as Gum Springs. Gladys Quander Tansel is the descendant of another family which has lived in that area for years. Her grandfather, Charles Henry Quander, had a difficult time gaining his freedom from slavery after the Civil War.
My grandfather was a slave on the Johnston plantation. And when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, my grandfather was not granted his freedom. Each day he expected to find it, but it never came until one day he decided he would leave. He had learned to read and write his name from exchange of food with the Union soldiers who met him every evening. When he finally realized that he had stayed long enough, he told the Johnsons he was leaving. They agreed to pay him, and he in turn bought 2 acres of property from them.
The quilt that was lovingly made by the Black Women United for Action gives us insight to the active and diverse lives of African Americans in Fairfax County over the past 200 years. They, just as descendants of white settlers, have contributed with foresight, generosity, and imagination to the development of this county. What is now the Dulles Toll Road area is perhaps what Alfred Audrick dreamed for his family and friends, an easily accessed multi-layered community of schools, churches, and places for neighborhood activity. Areas that were settled by African American families are known today for different landmarks. On the Bell property stands the Barcroft View Apartments, where the Hunters family resided. Jeb Stuart High School is now located, and Heads Hill Farm, once owned by Andrew, Brian, and finally Clara, is now a subdivision. Throughout the county, street signs bear the names of African American trailblazers. Time has brought many changes, but community spirit and individual integrity has not changed. Even without census data and church records, oral family histories have allowed us to peer into the past. We still have much to learn about the African American experience, but we know that family, education, and religion have been important. In remembrance of the African American men and women who were enslaved in this country prior to 1865, the Black Women United for Action and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association sponsored a commemorative service. The service was held at the Slave Memorial at Mount Vernon in Alexandria in September 1990. America's first African American governor, L. Douglas Wilder of Virginia, grandson of slaves, spoke of the triumph of the human spirit during that period of United States history in which African Americans were treated so unjustly. He spoke strongly about what all Americans should know about the founding and building of our country.
I would hope that that time will come in America when the true and accurate history of how it has come to be will be taught in all of the schools. I would like to see any number of adults go back to school to learn a little about the history of this country and as to how it came to be. So for those of you who come today, I know you feel as proud as I do that those who have gone before indeed did not do so in vain in terms of the dreams and the aspirations they held for the high achievement and the possibility of the potential of African American descendants being achieved.
Let each of us take this opportunity to recognize and honor the contributions to Fairfax County by African Americans, contributions which have been ignored too long. African American achievement is nothing new in Fairfax County. Students of tomorrow will read history books that accurately depict contributions and accomplishments of African Americans.